So we're going to start with an invited talk and then go into contributed talks. So our invited speaker today is Johanna Teske, and she's going to be talking to us about the current landscape of exoplanets.
All right, welcome back from the break. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes, okay, thanks. We'll do the lights. Thanks to the SOC for the opportunity to be here. It's lovely to be back in Tucson. I went to grad school here, and so it's, yeah, really nice to see familiar faces and places. I went hiking in Sabino Canyon yesterday. I did not take this picture, but I'm going to talk to you about the landscape of exoplanets, so exoplanet demographics and how we relate their observed properties to their formation and evolution. Here, like I said, I'm showing this beautiful Tucson landscape, and I want to recognize that we're meeting on the ancestral homelands of the, I'm going to mess up the name, Tohono O'odham, I know that's wrong, nation, and also the home of the Pascoyaki tribe who resides within the Tucson area. And so I just want to express gratitude that that we're able to learn and work here, and also to the staff at the University of Arizona Noir Lab for making this a safe and comfortable place to work. So let's get started. I'm contractually obligated to show you this plot in an exoplanet demographics talk. Thank you, NASA Exoplanet Archive, which just reached 6,000 confirmed exoplanets, so yay. The colors on this plot don't matter so much right now. Those are different different detection techniques, but I'll come back to that a little bit later. The point of this is there's so much that I could cover about the demographics of exoplanets. I can't fit it all into even probably an entire conference, and so definitely not a 25-minute talk, but I'm going to pick and choose a few subpopulations of planets and some trends that we've observed in their properties to give you an idea of the types of studies and conclusions that we can come to about their formation. And try to relate that back to some solar system topics when I can. So this is definitely my biased view. It's definitely more of a broad versus deep view. So with that, let's get started. I want to start with the first type of planets discovered around sun-like stars, hot Jupiters, which we've heard a little bit about already. So thanks, Stephen, for setting me up very well. Hot Jupiter formation is perhaps, because these are the first exoplanets detected around sun-like stars, the longest open question in exoplanet science. So here from this nice review from Rebecca Dawson and John Johnson, they outlined just a few of the possible formation scenarios, something like in situ formation, where the planet forms very close to the star and migrates to its current very short orbital period location. That really requires a very large buildup of solids in the inner disk, so it seems unlikely. What might be more likely is something like a pulled-in scenario, or disk migration, as it's also known as, where the gas giant forms farther out and then interacts with the gas and dust in the disk and is pulled into a closer orbit. And then kind of the third flavor is a more dynamical option where the planet forms far away, it's pulled off kilter by another object, and then the resulting eccentric orbit eventually brings it closer to the star. And so how do we try to distinguish between these different formation scenarios? We've heard a little bit about this, so it's tying into the talk that we heard in the last session, but just to review, many hot Jupiters have orbits that are misaligned with their host stars. And so how can we use that to help us distinguish between these different scenarios? Oop, yes, I did an arrow, exciting. So the first thing I wanted to distinguish was the possibility of a primordial misalignment of these hot Jupiter orbits versus a post-formation, more dynamical process type of cause of their misalignment. And we have a few pieces of evidence to really suggest that it is the post-formation option that seems more likely. So there's lots of papers that now have shown that single warm Jupiters, so these are Jupiter mass, Jupiter size planets, but that are on more like 10 to 100 or 200 day orbital periods. Those do not show the misalignments that we see in hot Jupiters. And so if you had a disk that was initially misaligned and planets were migrating in that towards their host star, you wouldn't necessarily expect that to preferentially misalign just hot Jupiters. You might also see this misalignment in warm Jupiters, but we don't see that even around hotter stars. And then Work has also shown using a similar velocity dispersion age dating mechanism that misaligned systems are relatively older than aligned systems. And so there's an age difference in this, and that suggests more of a post-formation process to cause these misaligned orbits in the giant planets. And so, yes, we think probably something is happening afterwards. But what's interesting is this time resolution studies that we have seen, as well as detections of some hot Jupiters having nearby planetary companions. They're not all young, or sorry, they're not all alone. That might point towards multiple formation channels for hot Jupiters. It's not that they all formed in this high eccentricity migration scenario, but there might be some that actually had a slightly more quiescent, more disk-driven migration. Brandon, I know Radzim has a poster, I think a virtual poster, and papers where you can read more about that. So I also, if anyone is interested in this idea for a JDOC proposal, come talk to me later because I've been percolating on one. We can also look at the compositions of giant planets as a way to try to understand how they formed. And so in these plots, this is a kind of review paper from Mark Swain et al., where the top plot is showing, the plots are showing same things, but the top plot has exoplanets with both atmospheric, so transit-derived metallicities of their atmospheres in the dark points. And then the gray points are density-derived metallicities, so like a bulk metallicity. And the top plot just has planets where both of those things are measured in the same planet. And then the bottom plot is just everything, so the points don't necessarily connect. The point of this study, or these plots, was looking at Jupiter in the do I dare use the pointer? Looking at Jupiter, there's some overlap between these two, like density-derived versus transit-derived metallicities. And sorry, this is plotted as a function of planet mass. But for basically the exoplanets and other solar system planets, there seems to be a difference between, or at least more scatter in the atmospheric metallicities, transit-derived metallicities, versus the density-derived metallicities. And what the authors suggest then is that this is pointing towards these planets not being entirely well mixed, that there's some stratification in when you compare these two metallicities, and that perhaps subsequent atmospheric evolution in the exoplanets is important for causing a lot of scatter in the atmospheric metallicities, much more so than in the bulk density derived metallicities. I will point to a new paper by Yadi Chachan that just came out like at the end of last week or this week that updates this trend you see in the mass metallicity relation. It's not just linear. It seems to have a little bit of a tail. But I think this is interesting given the latest modeling of Juno data, which suggests that Jupiter's interior probably also has compositional gradients, and that there are deep regions with more heavy elements. Lots of caveats to this study. For those like in the know, how you do the atmospheric metallicities has lots of nuances. This is mostly based on HST data versus what we're getting from JDOST. But I think this is an interesting idea to be comparing these two types of metallicities. Oop, I didn't start my timer, so I'll be watching the timer. That being said, these are also comparing for the solar system giants, mostly metallicity measured from carbon, from methane in their atmospheres, versus for, in this study, exoplanets, these are mostly from water, from HST observations. And so you might wonder, are those really comparable? Could they have different mass metallicity relations based on what species you're measuring? And most of the close-in hot Jupiter planets that we're making these measurements for are too hot for methane to be abundant, so it's hard to make a one-to-one or apples-to-apples comparison. But Shubham Kanodia has a large JDOST Cycle 2 program that's been getting data on giant planets around M dwarfs. Which might actually be better to compare to solar system planets because you can do both water and methane abundance measurements in their atmospheres and then test whether those mass metallicity relations are these are simulations, this is not the data yet, whether those are similar, they have similar slopes or different, and look at, the enrichment of these different species. As a teaser, the first paper came out with the first object, and it's completely unexpected, or I don't know, was unexpected to me. So definitely talk to Shubham about those results, and he also has a poster. Okay, I didn't want to give no love to the outer giant planets, so I just have a little snippet in here about these. This is Brendan Bowler gave a great Sagan Summer Workshop talk about outer giant planets and their demographics. So this is stolen from him, where he's compiled a bunch of occurrence rate studies of these types of planets. And the major takeaway here is just the peak in the distribution is kind of corresponding to just at or just beyond the water ice line and sun-like stars, about where dust or disk surface density has a peak. And so either that suggests giant planets are forming with particularly high efficiency there, or if they're migrating in, somehow they get stalled there after coming in from wider orbits. I'll talk a little, if I have time, I'll talk a little bit more about outer giant planets. If you work in exoplanets, or even if you don't, you know that we love giving weird names to things. And so the Neptune landscape now is Neptune Desert, Neptune Ridge, Neptune Savannah. We have warm Jupiters, hot Jupiters. I've heard like tropical Jupiters. So it doesn't end. The lack of short period Neptune-ish planets is, we think, an important indicator of planetary evolution. So just looking at a few characteristics of these planets, the desert planets, so the very close in Neptunes, that it's not a completely empty desert. There's a little bit of water or a little bit of planets, but these planets are, they're dense, but less massive than the ridge planets. Their mass and radii don't decrease at short orbital period. You see a range there. The host stars tend to be more metal rich, more like the hot Jupiter population. And the upper edge of this envelope, those planets don't appear to be losing their atmospheres, like atmospheric escape observations, they're not detected there. The ridge planets are dense subneptunes, but also ones that have high mass. They have more eccentric orbits than the planets in the savannah, and have some of those orbits are misaligned. Their host stars are also more metal rich. And then our savannah planets, these don't have escaping atmospheres detected. There's not really a trend between their orbital period and density. There's not this higher host star metallicity preference, and these mostly have low eccentricities. And so taking all these observed properties, the story that we can tell about these planets and I'll go backwards, I'll go back in. Oh, no, go, whoa, what's way? Okay, this way. So we think the savannah planets, probably the majority of them have come into their current orbits through disk-driven migration, or that they might have just formed close in. They're pretty dynamically quiet for the most part. These are where low-density Neptunes, like fluffy Neptunes, tend to be found as well. The ridge planets, that's probably the threshold for where atmospheric erosion is starting through photoevaporation. These might have some disk-driven migration, and then, like I said, erosion of their atmospheres, and maybe some late high eccentricity migration for the larger Neptunes. And in the desert, sort of a similar scenario, some disk-driven migration and with atmospheric erosion, as well as a little bit of high eccentricity migration, so a mix of these. The upper boundary here is probably best explained by tidal disruption of gas giant planets following their high eccentricity migration in. And then the lower boundary is probably like a photoevaporation boundary. Yes, okay. Now, this is sort of my bread and butter, small planets. And so if you've been to an exoplanet conference and haven't heard about, well, you wouldn't have been to an exoplanet conference and not heard about the radius gap. There's this gap that is in orbital period versus planet radius space that separates these small planets. These are mostly from detections based on Kepler into these two populations, the super Earths, which are the smaller planets, and the sub-Neptunes, which are larger planets. Although Scott Shepard recently asked, why don't we call them sub-Uranuses? And do we need an answer to that? I just looked at him. I was like, Yeah. So this was actually one of those kind of rare, maybe cases where something about exoplanets was predicted ahead of time, and then we found it. We weren't so surprised. And so the leading theory to explain this is this atmospheric photoevaporation, where high energy photons from the star are carving out this gap. So the planets above the evaporation valley have been able to hold on to a small, a little bit of their initial primordial envelopes, whereas the ones below it have lost those envelopes over time. And so that's, like I said, a leading theory. So kind of stellar radiation from the outside is causing the mass loss. Core powered mass loss is another, more internally heat-driven possibility for causing the atmospheric escape. In both cases, in both of these cases, the two components, or the planets can be explained by sort of two components: hydrogen helium primordial envelope accreted from the nebula on top of basically twiddle rock, like a core. And this is a simulation from Rogers and Owen in 2019, where they showed through a photoevaporation model, you can match this population, this observed population, with a pretty narrow distribution of core compositions, and that composition is roughly Earth-like. So it's some combination of rock and iron, but you don't need a large water fraction to be able to match the observed radius period distribution. However, that might not be the full story when you fold in things like mass, and as I'll get to, some of the atmospheric observations. And if you look at population synthesis models of exoplanets, it's very hard to get planets that are totally dry. And so it may be that some sub-Neptunes can have large water reservoirs, actually, and that's what's being shown in this plot, which is, oh, I think I cut off the bottom axis. Sorry, this is planet mass versus radius. And maybe some of these intermediate sub-Neptunes are actually, you can explain them with interior models that have a large water fraction. There's other possibilities, like maybe there is an intrinsically rocky population that just never had atmospheres. There's lots of debate in the field about what's going on here. And so active area of research. But in any case, these planets probably do not have such distinct like gas rock layers. And so this was predicted theoretically, and like, yeah, I was saying earlier, like people who study the solar system are like, duh, like where it's not an onion. Like we know there are layers, gradients and non-distinct layers in solar system planets as well. But we're probably seeing evidence of that. We may be seeing evidence of that in sub-Neptunes like TOI 27DD, which this is just kind of a cartoon model showing that it might not be onion layers, but more of a gradient. And this is based on atmospheric observations where the atmosphere is not hydrogen rich, but it's not super metal rich either, metals in terms of astronomy metals. It's somewhere in between. And so the authors propose that there's this miscible supercritical envelope where hydrogen and water are miscible together. And so this might actually be the typical scenario for sub-Neptune planets. Going back one slide, actually. So what is sort of, or what was exciting to me about looking for water-rich sub-Neptunes or small planets was maybe if they have water, that is a signpost of them forming outside the ice line and migrating inwards. And so if we're looking for like, how do we distinguish when and where these planets formed? If we look for water-rich planets, maybe that will tell us that they have formed outward beyond the ice line and migrated inwards. But because of these hydrogen water envelopes being in direct contact with, probably for a lot of, but maybe not all, sub-Neptunes, a magma ocean, so a not solid surface. Those interactions can actually form water and what's the word? Endogenically, and like on the planet itself. And so it's possible to get water-rich or fairly water-rich planets without them having migrated at all. They can just form the water themselves. So that messes up my idea of looking for water to find out about formation, but it's very interesting and actually was used in a paper by Young, Shahar, and Schlichting to taking this idea from exoplanet studies and trying to actually apply it to explain Earth's low density core, the oxidation state of the mantle, and Earth's water content. And so I thought this was a cool example of an idea that was sort of inspired. I think it had been floating around, but they took it and ran with it from the exoplanet community and applied it to informing how we think the Earth formed. All right. The last thing I wanted to talk about is there appears to be, so now like I've talked about different populations of planets, now kind of relating two of them, a correlation between the presence of inner small, so super Earth or sub-Neptune, anything less than about 4 Earth radii, planets, and the outer gas giant planets. So there have been a slew of papers about this. Marta Bryan and Eve Lee have a recent one where they were looking at both the metallicity and the stellar mass dependence of this. And so in these plots, the correlation between, or the probability of having a gas giant given that there's a super Earth in the system, it's definitely metallicity dependent. And so the kind of greeny colors are just having a gas giant, and the probability is enhanced at high metallicity in most cases when you also have a super Earth or I guess, yeah, they're calling some Neptune super Earths, the nomenclature thing. But there's also this stellar mass dependence. And so they're not seeing that in the M-dwarf systems. And so if you're looking for this, it needs to be around more metal rich and higher mass stars. And this idea has like also been interesting and inspiring to me because as I understand it, the cause or the origin of this dichotomy in non-carbonaceous and carbonaceous chondrites in the solar system, there is this dichotomy in their isotope space, whether that has been caused by Jupiter blocking material from a lot of mixing. That seems like not the only explanation. That's one possible explanation. And so this is just really intriguing to me to see whether we could detect, we're not gonna be able to, okay, we can't measure isotopes in exoplanet systems, but could we detect some hint of giant planets affecting the compositions of inner planets in exoplanet systems? And that might also depend on disk mass and stellar mass, so it could be a degenerate problem, but I'm also excited about this idea. Okay, in my probably 1 or 2 minutes, I just want to mention a few missions on the horizon that you can be excited about. One isn't even on the horizon, it's right now. And so a major question that JDOST is supposed to answer in the coming years is whether this cosmic shoreline, so looking at the kind of cyan line in that upper plot, which separates in escape velocity versus XUV radiation space, objects in the solar system that do and do not have atmospheres. Is this common, or does this happen in exoplanet systems or not? Do they follow the same trend, or is it a different trend? Is there no trend? And so there's a 500-hour director's discretionary program with Space Telescope where they're looking at the orange circles in secondary eclipse, so an emission, to try to detect whether these planets have atmospheres or not. These are all planets around M-dwarfs, so that's an extra complicating factor. But the small planets that are easiest to observe are all around M-dwarfs. So I think in the coming years, we'll have an answer to this. Next year, I think at the end of next year is supposed to be Gaia DR4. And so that's going to really be probing the outer parts of exoplanet systems. And so help us not just know the occurrence rate, kind of peak, but also maybe look more at the characteristics of these long period giant planets, like their system architectures. So I'm excited about that. Next year is also the Plato mission, which has many goals, and it's quite complementary to previous missions. So it's not quite all sky, but it's covering more area than Kepler, and is staring longer. And so it's really trying to get a better estimate of this eta Earth. How common are Earth-sized planets in the habitable zones of their stars, particularly solar type stars. And then by May 2027, we'll have the Roman Space Telescope, which will be doing not only a microlensing survey, so getting down really to like Mars-sized planets. So this is not something we can do with other techniques, as well as lots of transiting planets and looking at planet occurrence across the galaxy. So I've given you a taste of what we can learn by examining the properties of exoplanets. This is a more fun version of the diagram I showed before. So this is now just ordered in terms of temperature. We can already make some comparisons to solar system planets. And I think these opportunities are going to only grow with time. And so that means lots of opportunities to collaborate and learn together. And so I think, yeah, there are many reasons to be hopeful about addressing the question, is the solar system unique in the galaxy? So I'll stop there and take questions.
Thanks, Johanna. That was an excellent overview of where we are and where we're going. Questions for Johanna? And a reminder, oh, one right here, perfect.
Hi, Naman Bajaj from University of Arizona. Thanks for a great talk. So I was wondering, in terms of the population of close-in misaligned planets, is there a population that would be better explained by misaligned disk, like formation in a misaligned disk? Because at the same time, we are seeing that a pretty big fraction possibly of disk is also misaligned.
Yes, so I forgot to mention, Laura Biddle's a U of A alum and just published a paper where there was like a 30% fraction of disks that were misaligned. So I still haven't quite processed that and how that fits in. And so yeah, I don't know quite how to parse that yet.
Other questions? And do we have any online? No. Oh, yep.
Hi, Finnegan Keller, ASU. You showed some plots about sort of interior compositions of subneptunes. I'm wondering to what extent you think JWST can actually break some of the degeneracies there and actually tell us what on Earth a subneptune is, or perhaps what on Neptune a subneptune is.
Yeah, so BJ Fulton also gave a Sagan Summer Workshop, and that was the title of his talk, like what is a subneptune? And I think, yes, the JWST observations are helping break, when you only have a bulk density, there can be multiple compositions that fit that. And if you can measure water abundances, for example, in the planet atmospheres, you can break that degeneracy and say, this is how much of the planet is the atmosphere, and that's what it's made of, and this is how much is the kind of rocky core. But so far, it's been challenging because many of the small planet atmosphere observations have not shown molecular features. They've just been flat in terms of the transmission spectra, at least. And so I think we're still a little bit in the dark with that. Trying to get slightly cooler or slightly warmer planets might help, or going to different wavelength regimes. So I think that's, we'll see what cycle 5 brings.
We have time for one more quick question.
Thank you for the great talk, Amy Chusin from NASA Goddard. I was just wondering, so a lot of these upcoming missions are trying to push towards longer period planets. What is one thing that you hope that we will learn from those?
Yes, I am very excited about this inner-outer correlation between small planets inside and large planets outside. And so, for example, a project I'm interested in is for the small planets with and without the Jupiters. The Jupiter analogs, do they have different compositions or not? And we can start to see some of that with like the long-term RV studies to know if there's giant planets. But Gaia, for example, will help map out those systems in the outer parts. And so basically system architectures and what we can learn about composition versus system architecture.
Thank you.
I just want to say one more thing. Like to be inspiring, this is also what's on the horizon. This was at an outreach event a couple of weekends ago. This is on the National Mall, like in the thick of it, and these are kids who are super excited about exoplanets. So this is what's on the horizon.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Let's thank Johanna one more time and get the next speaker ready.